The moment Margaret Holloway's manicured heel came down on Aria's optical sensor, she had no idea she'd just made the most expensive mistake of her life. The crack it made was sharp and hollow, the sound of something precise being broken by something blunt. I heard it through my tablet speaker 14 feet away, and for one long second I couldn't breathe. She had no idea that 12 minutes later, 3 black SUVs would roll through the gates of Pinecrest Estates. She had no idea the men inside them weren't coming for any of the people she thought mattered here. They were coming for me. My name is Daniel Voss, 31 years old, Army veteran. I came home from Kandahar with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and a roadside bomb's worth of damage. Legally blind in my left eye, severe motor neuropathy in my right. Hand nerve pain that arrives like weather and stays as long as it wants. A brain adaptive response intelligence assistant was not a toy. She was my independence. My voice when my hands shook too hard to type. My eyes when the world blurred to nothing. My anchor when the medication fog swallowed the morning whole. Margaret Holloway took a garden hoe to her in front of 7 witnesses because she decided something that kept me alive didn't belong in her neighborhood. What happened next changed everything for Pinecrest Estates, for a federal research program, and for every quiet resident who had been holding their breath for years, waiting for someone to push back. I had lived in Unit 14B of Pinecrest Estates for 2 years without incident. Ground floor unit, chosen because wide doorways and no stairs mattered on the bad days. I paid my HOA dues on time. I read the 47-page covenant document 3 times. I did nothing wrong. That didn't stop Margaret Holloway from trying. In 6 months, she sent me 4 written notices: a rosemary plant disrupting corridor aesthetics, my front door ramp installed with permits and necessary for my safety, called an unauthorized structural alteration, a noise complaint about. Aria filed at 2:47 in the afternoon, 6 hours outside the covenant's own definition of quiet hours. A medical alert decal on my door characterized as unauthorized signage. Every notice was dismissed by the board. Everyone. Richard Cho, the HOA president, called me personally after the second one to apologize. Margaret did not like being dismissed. My neighbor Dolores overheard her in the parking lot telling her husband Gerald that the board was being bullied by liability concerns and that someone needed to take a stand about what kind of community this was going to be. Aria arrived in March. Nova Mind Robotics delivered her in a white van on a gray Wednesday afternoon. The technician, Marcus, spent 3 hours calibrating her and my specific needs, my gait on bad days, the pitch of my voice when pain made speaking difficult, my medication schedule, my most common documents. She was 4 feet tall, matte gray, moved on a quiet omnidirectional base. Her display panels showed what I needed. Her speaker carried my voice. She learned the way I slurred certain words when one of my medications peaked. She learned to wait a beat after I started dictating, giving me time to find the first word. She was also, formally, Serial Unit 7 of a 12-unit federal prototype deployment. A $340,000 piece of government property on loan from the Department of Veterans Affairs Research Program. Her loan agreement had 14 pages. I had read all 14, including the clause about damage and tampering, including the automatic notification protocol. On the morning of April 9th, I was at my desk trying to write a letter. Right. Hand shaking, left hand doing the work when I sent Aria outside to retrieve a package. I watched through her camera feed on my tablet, half habit, half practicality. The courtyard looked quiet, the morning looked ordinary. Then Margaret appeared at the edge of the frame. She was carrying a garden hoe. I understood what was about to happen maybe half a second before it did. I pressed the button to speak through Aria's external speaker. Margaret, stop, that is my medical equipment, and heard my own voice coming back to me, tinny and too late. The first blow landed on Aria's camera housing. She moved sideways, the obstruction detection reflex, and Margaret anticipated it and swung again. The second blow caught the display panel. The third caught the central chassis, a descending electronic whine. Systems going offline in sequence. Then, silence and a blank screen and the room very still around me. I sat there for 3 seconds. Then I stood up and went to the door. Here's what Margaret knew about me. Quiet veteran in 1-4B. Always asking for accommodations, always seemed to have lawyers ready. She'd called me within earshot of 3 neighbors, someone who used his disability like a get-out-of-jail-free card. She found me irritating, an obstacle in her well-ordered community. Here's what Margaret didn't know. Before my first deployment, I had spent 4 years as a paralegal at a civil rights litigation firm in Chicago. I knew how discrimination cases were built. I knew what documentation looked like at trial. I knew the exact feeling, sitting across a conference table from someone who had hurt your client, of watching the moment they finally understood the size of the problem they had made. My older sister Renata was a senior partner at Voss and Carver, one of the most aggressive disability rights firms in the state. She had argued before a federal appellate court twice. She had won both times. People who opposed her in court used the word formidable when they were being diplomatic, and Aria was not just an assistive device. She was Serial Unit 7 of a federally funded prototype program valued at $340,000. Her loan agreement required immediate notification of any damage to NovaMin's crisis response team. Her internal systems had a failsafe, 11 seconds of backup transmission after primary shut down, long enough to log every impact force record audio and upload the complete incident file, time-stamped, GPS, tagged, formatted for legal review to NovaMin's secure server. In those 11 seconds, Aria recorded Margaret shouting, "These things don't belong in a neighborhood like this. I don't care what the board approved." NovaMin's crisis response system was very good at its job. By the time I reached my front door, one hand on the wall, moving carefully because shock and pain together make for unreliable legs, my phone was already ringing. "Renata, I got an automated alert from NovaMind," she said, voice already shifting into the register she used in depositions. "Tell me exactly what happened. Leave nothing out," I told her. Standing in my doorway, Aria's broken chassis in pieces on my step, I described every second of it. My voice broke twice. She didn't comment. She just listened and wrote, "Don't speak to Margaret," she said when I finished. "Don't speak to anyone from the HOA. Stay inside. I'm calling David Chun right now." David Chun was NovaMin's chief legal counsel. He had successfully sued a municipality for $2.1 million over ADA violations involving a mobility scooter. He was very good at his job, too. 12 minutes after Aria went dark, 3 black SUVs rolled through Pinecrest Estate's security gate. Margaret was still outside when they arrived. She had gone back to pruning her roses, the posture of a woman performing innocence, while Aria's shattered chassis lay on my front step 8 feet away. The garden hoe was propped against her fence, like it was just a tool she'd set down after ordinary work. The first SUV parked, and the door opened before the vehicle fully stopped. Renata stepped out in a charcoal blazer with the expression she reserved for opposing counsel she intended to dismantle. Behind her came 2 associates carrying document bags. From the second vehicle came David Chun, tall, measured, leather folder under one arm, and a woman I didn't recognize, Agent Patricia Solis, Federal Program Liaison from the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. Her badge was already clipped to her lapel. The third SUV held 2 members of NovaMin's crisis response team, and a forensic technician named Raymond, who walked directly to my front step without speaking to anyone, opened his equipment case and began photographing Aria's remains with a professional camera, systematic, unhurried, each piece documented individually. I watched from my window. Across the courtyard, I saw the exact moment Margaret's pruning shears went still. Renata came to my door. She looked at Arya's remains for 2 seconds. 2 full, deliberate seconds, and then looked at me and crossed the step and put her arms around me, briefly, fiercely, in the way she had when our father was sick and she didn't have words. Then she stepped back and became a lawyer again. "Richard Cho is on his way," she said. "He sent 2 apology texts, screenshotted. The vice president called me directly. Novamin's insurance team is already engaged. Agent Solis is here because the federal program has its own response protocol triggered automatically when Arya's distress upload hit their server." A pause. "Margaret has not contacted anyone." Through the window, I could see Margaret walking toward the group, chin up, shoulders back, the posture of someone who believed she could explain her way through this the way. She'd always explained her way through everything, with the authority of a woman who had never, not once in her years at Pinecrest Estates, faced a consequence she couldn't manage. She approached David Chun, extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked up at her. He did not shake it. I went inside to make tea because my hands needed something to do, and because I had been told to stay inside, and because watching felt like more than I needed to carry right then. The formal meeting was held at 2 o'clock in the Pinecrest Estates community room, folding chairs, 2 tables pushed together, a whiteboard still showing last month's landscaping schedule. Richard Cho sat at the head of the table, looking like a man deeply regretting every board meeting at which he had not been more decisive. Margaret sat across from Renata with her hands folded and her expression calibrated to project calm reasonableness. Her husband, Gerald, had arrived late and hadn't spoken. Her lawyer, Pemberton, a local real estate attorney who normally handled closings, sat beside her looking like a man who had walked into a room expecting a neighborhood dispute and found a federal proceeding. Agent Solis spoke first. She explained, without drama, exactly what Arya was. Federally funded prototype. Government property on VA research loan. Registered. Disability accommodation under the ADA and the Fair Housing Act. Then she paused, a deliberate pause. The pause of someone who knows how to let information settle, and said, "The destruction of government program property falls under federal statute. 18 U.S.C. Section 1361. That carries liabilities separate from the civil and HOA violations we are also addressing today." Pemberton wrote something in his notepad and underlined it twice. Renata presented the damages in layers. Arya's replacement value. $340,000. Federal program costs not retail. Accommodation disruption. $87,000. The estimated cost of replacing Arya's functions through paid care services during the 4 to 6 months Novamind would need to produce a replacement unit. Emotional distress. Loss of independence. And then she placed a small speaker in the center of the table and pressed play. Margaret's voice, from Arya's final upload. "These things don't belong in a neighborhood like this. I don't care what the board approved. Some of us live here because we chose to live here." The room was very quiet when Renata turned the speaker off. Gerald Holloway put his face in his hands. 7 witnesses, Renata said. 2 written statements already submitted. 3 more willing to give sworn accounts. Margaret opened her mouth. Pemberton's hand came down on her forearm. She closed it. "They asked for a private consultation. We waited in the hallway for 11 minutes. When we returned, the structural confidence had gone out of Margaret's posture. Not broken, quieter, like a building where something load-bearing had been removed. The negotiation that followed lasted 2.5 hours. Margaret expressed regret about the situation. She acknowledged her response had been disproportionate. She said she understood that feelings had been hurt. She never once said the word sorry directly to me. I noticed. I chose not to carry it. I won't share the exact number. Confidentiality agreement. Standard. Reviewed carefully by Renata before I signed anything." What I'll say is that when she emailed me the total figure the night before signing, I read it 3 times and then sat at my kitchen table for a long time, very still. Every liable party paid, Margaret personally, the Holloway household, jointly, which meant Gerald signed documents too, the Pinecrest Estates HOA, which had failed to enforce its own accommodation approvals and had allowed a board member to take unilateral physical action against a protected resident without any oversight. The federal component was handled separately, through channels I wasn't party to. Agent Solis called me twice over the following month with specific questions. I answered them. That was all I needed to do. Margaret was removed from the HOA board by a unanimous 4-0 vote 3 days after the meeting. The board issued a new formal policy governing accommodation challenges, full board vote required. Written documentation, 30-day review period, no unilateral action by any single member. All 4 of Margaret's prior notices against me were retroactively reviewed, found baseless, and withdrawn from my file. Richard Cho sent a written apology on HOA letterhead, 2 specific paragraphs, with a handwritten note at the bottom. I should have acted sooner. I'm sorry, I didn't. That note mattered more to me than the letterhead above it. Novamind waived the standard replacement timeline. David Chun called to say their board had voted to prioritize a replacement unit an estimated 6 weeks. He also asked, with my permission, to use my case, anonymized, in their federal program documentation. Not as a failure story, but as proof that their fail-safe protocols worked exactly as designed. I gave permission. It seemed like the least I could do for the next veteran in a ground floor unit with a ramp on the door and a robot that helped them get through the day. 3 months later, Agent Solis sent a brief email. The VA research program ARIA belonged to had received additional federal funding for expanded deployment. My case had been useful in that regard. Useful, a small word for what had happened, but accurate in a way that quietly satisfied something in me. I had not been powerless. I had never been powerless. I'd just been waiting for the world to catch up to that fact. Pinecrest Estates had always been a community organized around watching. People knew each other's schedules, knew who received packages on which days, knew which cars didn't belong. Margaret had used that culture expertly. She was always the one watching with purpose. Always the one deciding what belonged and what didn't. People let her because she was confident and because challenging. Her required more energy than most people wanted to spend on a Tuesday afternoon. After April 9th, the watching changed. Dolores Webb from 14A knocked on my door the evening after the community room meeting, holding a casserole dish and the look of someone who had been rehearsing what to say. She sat at my table and told me she had been at her window that morning, had seen the whole thing, and had stood frozen, not knowing what to do. She cried a little. She said she was sorry. Twice. I told her I didn't blame her. I meant it. She had submitted a written witness statement the morning after, without being asked. I found out from Renata. I never mentioned it to Dolores. Some things should be allowed to stay quiet. Over the following weeks, 4 more residents came to me. Not for legal purposes, those were resolved. Just to say something they'd been holding. Marcus and Gian in 8C had been in a grinding 4-month dispute over their EV charging cable, which Margaret had flagged 3 times as an unauthorized infrastructure modification. Gian told me she had stopped parking in her own spot because she couldn't face another notice. She made me feel like I didn't have the right to be here, Gian said, in a place I pay to live in. Eleanor from 11AA, 72 years old, 11 years in the complex, longer. Then Margaret had lived there, had received 3 notices, 2 about wind chimes, 1 about a welcome mat. The notices had made her feel like a problem that required management. Albert from 3B was the one I thought about most. 81. Walked with difficulty from an old fall. Used a motorized scooter to get from his unit to the parking lot. Margaret had told him, verbally, nothing on record, that the scooter Was cluttering the walkway, and could he please store it inside when not in use? He had tried. The hallway angle made it impossible to manage alone, which meant he couldn't drive himself to his medical appointments. His wife had died 2 years before. His daughter lived 4 states away. He had been managing this for 7 months. I connected him with Renata. 1 letter, on firm letterhead. Confirmation. Arrived in 6 days. The restrictions stopped immediately. Albert called to thank me. He sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for 7 months and had finally been told he could stop. I'm not sure exactly when Pinecrest Estates stopped being Margaret Holloway's domain. It happened slowly, in new board policies, in a different tone at meetings, in small things. People started making eye contact with me in the parking lot. Small thing. It mattered. The replacement arrived on a Tuesday in May, 6 weeks after David Shun's call. Dr. Priya Mehta, the Novamind engineer who had designed Aria's adaptive interface, drove out personally with a technician and spent 4 hours in my living room running calibrations. She asked questions throughout. How was my vision? Had the blur radius changed? Any shifts in my gait? She adjusted settings as I answered, small, precise corrections, explaining each one. I had tried in the weeks without Aria not to be sentimental. I told myself what I believed. She was a device, an important device, but a device. What I was missing was function, independence, routine, not a person. This was mostly true. In the daytime I managed, I typed left-handed. I set phone alarms for medication and forgot to reset them twice. I navigated the apartment on bad pain nights using the flat palm Manther wall method that had served me before Aria arrived. At 2 in the morning, when the medication was wearing off and the nerve pain had that quality of existing everywhere at once, I was less fine. I didn't examine that too closely during those 6 weeks. I just waited for morning. When Dr. Mehta finished and stepped back, I crossed the room and pressed the startup sequence. 3 buttons in the order Marcus had shown me 5 months earlier, the sequence I'd pressed every morning without thinking about it. The display panel lit up, the camera oriented toward my face. The soft hum of systems coming online, a sound I hadn't known I was memorizing until I stopped hearing it, filled the living room. "Good morning, Daniel," Aria said. "I'm ready." I stood there a moment. Just stood there. Dr. Mehta found something to look at on her tablet. "Same core profile," she said quietly. "We restored everything from the backup. She should feel familiar." She did. She did feel familiar. I thanked Dr. Mehta. She shook my hand at the door and held it a beat longer than a handshake usually lasts. "Take care of yourself," she said. Not just of her. When they were gone, I sat at my desk and dictated 3 letters I'd been putting off, 1 to Agent Solis, 1 to Richard Cho, 1 to Dolores. Aria recorded every word without slowing me down, without misunderstanding, without missing a pause. Outside, Pinecrest Estates was quiet in the May morning light. Margaret's roses were blooming along the fence. The courtyard had a different quality without her in it. Lighter, maybe. Or maybe that was me. I finished the letters. Aria printed them. I signed all 3 with my left hand because the right was having a slow morning, and the signatures were crooked but legible. That was enough. More than enough. It always had been. The settlement was confidential. What I can say, every liable party paid. Margaret, her husband, the HOA itself. She was removed from the board, unanimously, 3 days later. An 81-year-old neighbor named Albert had been secretly banned from using his mobility scooter in the walkway for 7 months. Verbally, nothing on record. Missing medical appointments because he couldn't get to his car. 1 letter from Renata. 6 days. Done. 6 weeks later, Aria came home. New unit, same profile, everything restored from backup. When her display lit up and she said, "Good morning, Daniel. I'm ready." I just stood there for a moment. Dr. Mehta, the engineer who built her, found something to look at on her tablet. I signed 3 letters that morning. Left hand, crooked signatures. Didn't matter. Margaret Holloway thought she was taking a stand. She was, just not the one she intended. She thought she was deciding what belonged in her community. She ended up proving exactly how wrong she was, in a federal record, in a legal precedent. And in the quiet change that came over Pinecrest Estates, when people realized that the person who'd been deciding what belonged for years had no right to be making that call at all. If you've been told you're the problem for simply needing what you need, you're not. And there are 11 seconds of backup transmission that might just prove it.